Hey there, picture book enthusiasts. I'm Adam Lehrhaupt, author, illustrator, collaborator, and your friendly neighborhood picture book enthusiast. Welcome back to Picture This, where we explore bold, creative ways to bring picture books to life in your classroom. This week, we're going to talk about visual literacy. I once did a school visit where, before I even started talking, a student raised their hand and said, Mr. Adam, I like the pictures in your book better than the words. And I paused for a second and I thought about what this young reader had the courage to say. And I had to smile because definitely the same. And I have been blessed with some amazing illustrators, and they've just done wonderful, wonderful things in bringing ideas in my head to reality. And I think part of the secret of a picture book is that sometimes, a lot of times, the pictures really are the story. And today we're unpacking the magic of visual literacy, how kids can read images just as deeply as they read the text. So whether they're 4 or 15, students can learn to interpret, infer, and analyze illustrations in ways that boost empathy, vocabulary, critical thinking, all different aspects of what they're already learning in the curriculum and through the words they can get just by looking deeper into the visuals. And we've got some great picture books today where I'm going to show you how some of my favorite illustrators have done just that. So let's start with what is visual literacy to me. I'm sure, there's a dictionary definition of it, but let's get to what I call it so that we're using standard words and why I think it matters as an author. So the ability to interpret, negotiate, or make meaning from the various visual elements that you are presented with is visual literacy. So whether it's what you see outside your window or what you see in a painting or what you see in a page of a picture book, being able to interpret that and find meaning in that is what I consider to be visual literacy. And in a world where memes and 15-second reels and emoji-laced text messages, real visual literacy is becoming more essential than ever because they're just inundated with shorthand, and really being able to make sense of something gets lost when everybody's using cheats, right? Or when everything is 15 seconds long and you have to understand it and move on very, very quickly. So the benefits of visual literacy for me is a reader will build their ability to make inferences and analyze things by looking at the picture. So even if they can't read my text, they're going to infer things from those images. And when they hear the text, those things will connect for them. And that encourages observation, it encourages curiosity, it encourages a sense of wonder. And in addition, it supports both reluctant readers and multilingual learners, because if I don't understand the text in a book, I can still tell a story through the pictures. And when a child can decode words from an image or emotion in a character's face, we know they're learning empathy. They're learning how to sound things out for themselves sometimes. They're learning to notice patterns by looking in the backgrounds. They're learning to make predictions, and that's really at the core of literacy. So having good understanding of those visual cues helps even the most difficult readers. And trust me on this, I have one. I wasn't one, but one of my sons is a reluctant reader. The other one doesn't read. That's a little bit different. So even books with pictures. But yeah, I did have a reluctant reader. And once he got into stories that were more graphic in their storytelling, it made a huge, huge difference. So we're going to start off today talking about one of my books, illustrated by one of my favorite people, Scott Magoon. And I always say when I go into a school visit, I always say, let's say it with me, Scott Magoon. It's such a great name to say. It's not like a Lehrhaupt. Lehrhaupt's a difficult one. Scott and I worked on a book called I Will Not Eat You. And a lot of the tricks that he used in this book, his visual perspective, his tone, the way he builds suspense in very, very simple ways, really set up for a reader what's going to happen next in the story. And I don't think the story lands well without the way that he set it up. So this story is told mostly through dialogue and then reaction shots that Scott has. And for instance, at the beginning of the book, a bird has an interaction with this scary creature in a cave that we don't see the creature, but just in the bird's reaction to the creature, we know that it's something to be scared of. And a really good look at the pages, we'll see that the bird left a little something on the rocks below where he was flying for representation of just how scared the bird was. So the things like that help build the mood. They help show that this creature we haven't even seen is scary. And as larger and larger animals interact with it and then end up fleeing, the way that Scott creates those reaction shots and the sense of movement and just the pace that the animals are taking to leave really does help drive the story forward, right? So if you've got a grumpy dragon in a cave and with strange noises outside and visual clues, it all builds. So with this story, what I do when I'm talking to students in visits or readers at a bookstore, I want to ask them, what do you notice in the shadows? What do you notice other than the cave? What changes from one page to the next, and what stands out there, right? Why do you think the illustrator chose this angle for this particular scene? So there's a shot where Theodore, the main character in the book, you see up from below his claw, his talons, as he's standing over this boy. And it really is a great shot. And it gives the reader the feeling that they are that boy, right? So asking about that, asking what's happening that's not being said in the text. What do you notice that I didn't say anything about, right? And then an activity to tie with is create a visual suspense story, right? Have students draw out a very, very simple story with an off-page mystery, something you don't see. What can you create on that page that tells us what might be hiding just out of sight, right? Show only part of the scene in each panel. And then the final panel is the big reveal, right? For instance, it might be something like opening a birthday gift, right? So the first thing is the card. The next thing is the tear in the paper. The next thing is the boxes starting to open. And then the last one is looking inside a box and it's empty, right? It can be anything like that, but you can take these little steps and create a very, very simple story in panels that builds up to something, right? Create suspense. It doesn't have to be scary suspense. It can be joyful suspense as well. The second book I want to talk about is Lift by Min Lee and Dan Santat. Dan is absolutely unbelievable and has received some of the accolades to go with how talented he is. But Min Lee has created a story here with not a lot of text, right? So the journey that we go on, even though Dan has these very vibrant images, these glorious scenes that lead us through the narrative, that narrative is still structured in a way where readers are taken on this journey, and then they can rely on the collaboration from Dan of what are the facial expressions telling me? What is the action in this scene? How is it designed? How is it laid out? How does this scene, this panel change how you relate to the next one? And thinking about how that builds narrative flow into the story and how things work that way. Just again, pausing and asking questions, right? Really getting into that visual literacy with your students or children or, readers or whoever, and saying, what do you think just happened? What do you think that character in this scene or this picture thinks, right? what do you think they feel? What's going on inside of them? And what might they do next? And the activity to go with this is to create your own silent story. Draw a simple 3-panel comic, stick figures, whatever. It doesn't have to be people. It can be animals. It could be a fork falling downstairs. But create that with no words. So you have this 3-scene thing, and then let the students narrate it in their small groups, right? Or each of them can narrate it themselves and write a story. And then they can share that story based on what they see in those images. Third book I want to talk about is The Rock from the Sky by John Clausen. Also just an unbelievably talented illustrator, and his deadpan humor, the body language in the story, the repetition that creates the comic tension and pacing really set this story up in a unique way. But one of the things that John does in his in all of his books pretty much is he uses space differently than a lot of other illustrators. A lot of his stories have extra white space, and white space isn't always white. A lot of the time it is, but it doesn't have to be white. It's just empty space that allows your eye to focus on one thing and gives that thing import, right? So when you think about this book, discuss how outer space, in the images, posture, how he sets up the page turns in the story affect the storytelling, right? So my first book, called Warning, Do Not Open This Book, actually illustrated by one of John's very good friends, Matthew Forsyth, tells a story in page turns. You have to turn the page, like it kind of forces you to turn the pages, but the illustrations, the way that Matt illustrated it, sets up the story for those page turns, and John does that really, really well. So check out The Rock from the Sky for that, and really think about those visual clues. And then the activity for this is to act out the story using just physical cues. So like a pantomime. So they can't talk. They have to just pretend to be somebody without using words or noise, and see where that takes them. And they can do it in groups. They can do it together. They can do it one at a time. But acting out the story is a fun way to kind of incorporate that. So the third book, actually it would be the fourth, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Not good at math. I write. I don't add. That's why the good thing this isn't a STEM lesson here. We're going to talk about Mel Fell by Corey R. Tabor.
Sorry, Corey, I'm really not good at pronouncing names, but I want to make sure I say them so that you get the recognition. So in this story, the illustrations rotate. So you kind of turn the physical book and it turns it into a whole adventure in what you can do with a book other than just flipping pages, right? It's an extension of what we just talked about with The Rock from the Sky. And because you're turning the pages, because you're not just turning the pages, you're turning the book, it changes how we view the perspective, right? So if you keep the book one way, it looks wrong almost, right? So you're kind of forced to change how you're looking at something. And I always talk about there are certain students who learn very straight ahead. There are certain students who learn from the side, right? Or top down or bottom up. Everybody learns differently. And this is a great book for teaching alternate strategies, approaching problems from different directions. When you're thinking of an activity for this one, let them design a vertical story where the direction of the images reflects the action of the story. Is it going down? Is your character going up? Is it, tied to balloons and going up? Is it a rocket ship blasting off? Right? How can you, instead of going from left to right, write a story that goes in a different direction? Is it a diagonal? Is it backwards? How much fun can you have with a story that starts at the end, right? What happened at the beginning? How do we get from the end back to the beginning, right? What would your characters do to get from the end of the story back to the beginning of the story? And then I'm throwing in just one bonus mini mention here of Chalk by Bill Thompson. Not because I think I can pronounce Bill's name, but I think that in this book, the almost hyper-realistic images are really good for talking about sequencing and inference and prediction and putting all of those things together. So if you want to add in chalk, it's a great story for all of those different strategies. Taking a break for our sponsor, this episode is brought to you by your classroom bulletin board. You know,
that thing you put up once in September and try to avoid eye contact with until June. But what if it could teach? I'm not saying you stay home and let the billboard teach the class. I'm saying let's turn this into a visual literacy wall. And it's not going to be you creating everything. It's going to be your students posting drawings from books and explaining what the images say. Or maybe we just cover the wall with googly eyes. Honestly, that works too. Maybe not. Then they're just staring at you the whole time. Ooh, I take that back. Anyway, yes, you can grab a visual literacy stalker kit at adamlehrhaupt.com in the Picture This section. Or if that's too long, go to adaml.rocks. And right there will be a link to take you to the Picture This blog. Or you can go to if that's too long, you can go to adaml.rocks. Right there, you'll find a link to the Picture This podcast and blog. That's where you'll find your kit. Welcome back. Now it's time to get into Adam's book bag. In this week's episode of the book bag, we're going to talk about I Talk Like a River by Jordan Scott, illustrated by Sydney Smith. This one is personal. So my mom is a speech pathologist, and growing up, every once in a while, I would be around her when she was working with somebody and became friendly with somebody who had a stutter. I guess I should say this book is about a boy who stutters, and I really connect to that story, not just because I knew somebody and became friends with somebody who had a stutter, but because it is a common thing and it's overlooked. If you look around, you will for sure know somebody who at some point in their life stuttered or stutters now. As a matter of fact, I have a good friend right now who does, and he has techniques and tactics that he uses, but in some situations you can't do anything about it. And this book tells the story of this boy and his difficulty and finding a way to think about it differently through soft, expressive watercolors. And those images say as much as the text ever could, and they really do help to soften what could be a very, very difficult story. So in this book, we look at the spreads and don't read the text. We just go through and say, what's happening here? What emotion do you think this character has? And what do you think they're going through? Why do you think they feel that way? What do you think this character's problem is? And in the end, what do you think they did to overcome it? Then go back and reread the story and compare that understanding, whether they got the story just with the images or if it adds another layer to have the text. As an author, I always think it adds another layer to have text, but in this particular case, I think it's a story that can really stand alone and can be used for all kinds of things, not just dealing with having a stutter. So with this, when I think of a prompt for being creative, I ask my students to think of a feeling or a memory that you've had that was difficult to express. And think about how you could express that without using any words. Sometimes it's easier to just draw something, right? Instead of saying it out loud, you can create a picture, and that picture might be enough. You don't even necessarily need to share it with anybody, but it can be a way to get that emotion out. And maybe use just colors, and use colors on the page to express what you're feeling, right? Blue for sadness, red for anger, right? Use shapes, or, if they're a little bit older, maybe they're using body language, right? What's your story look like with that simplicity to it? So this week's listener challenge is pick a wordless or a very low text picture book and co-read it with your class. Let your students read the illustrations aloud. Tell you what's going on and share your favorites with me on the socials. Use the hashtag picture this podcast and tell me what they said, what they did, or you can come to my website and put some comments below the podcast episode. Either way, please let me know what's going on, what worked, what didn't work, what fun and interesting things you got up to this week. So in summary, when talking about visual literacy, we really are teaching our students, our readers, our illustrators. Yes, as an author, I want to teach my illustrator as much as I can. Back to the cave, writing gnome. Anyway, we want to teach them to notice. Every illustrator that I've ever worked with goes out into the world and takes notice of things. They do research, they find details, they bring those details into their illustrations, and they leave them there for us as readers to find. And it's our job as readers to go and notice, right? Because noticing, that's where the real learning begins. So if you liked this episode, stop by for this episode's free download, my visual literacy tools. That can be found at the Picture This section of adamlehrhaupt.com or adaml.rocks. You'll get discussion questions, some activity templates, and as usual, the curated list of all the books that I talked about in the episode today. If you had a good time here, remember to subscribe, leave a review. Those really do help. Or pass this episode along to a fellow educator or parent who really loves a good story, especially the ones told without words.